Alright YouTube, we're back with our 2008 second generation Cadillac CTS, and we hit the 100,000 mile mark not long ago, and I feel like ever since then we've been really piling these videos on YouTube. Today's video we're going to be tackling replacing the main water pump, and so there are a few other videos on YouTube that tackle this, but they're all for the first generation CTS. And while the second generation is pretty similar, I figured we'd go ahead and do a video specifically for the second generation. So the way we discovered there was a problem was that a couple of weeks ago check engine light came on, and so we pulled the codes and we were getting P2601, which is coolant pump control circuit range / performance. Now I'm actually familiar with this code. A couple of years ago the car started throwing it, and in that particular instance what had happened is the auxiliary water pump had failed. This car has a small electric secondary auxiliary water pump that comes on, basically when the demand is higher than what the main water pump can handle. And so replaced that pump, which the pump was definitely bad because it felt all gritty when you tried to turn the impeller and didn't want to move. And that cleared it up, but the code would come back intermittently over the next few days. And what I discovered is that I had lost a little more coolant than I thought during the process of changing that pump. And so the coolant was low, and once we topped off the coolant, didn't see the code again for a couple of years until the other day. So when I saw that code come back up, I thought, oh, well, maybe the pump's going back. Well, yeah, let me check the coolant level. And sure enough, it was low. And I put some in, and it seemed okay for the next few days. But every night when I'd come home, my wife gets home before me, and I noticed kind of that sweet coolant smell in the garage. And I thought, I don't know about this. And after about a week, I checked the coolant again, and it was pretty low again. So I knew it was going somewhere. Did a little bit of investigation. Pulled the car out that evening. There was a puddle under the car. So it was kind of an intermittent thing. It wasn't doing it all the time, and so it wasn't like I could just run the car and see the leak. So I'm not sure exactly what it takes to do it, but some days she'd come home and the smell was really strong, and some days it was almost nothing, so it wasn't doing it every day. So I did some poking around, and finally with a mirror was able to see the bottom of the water pump. There was, you could tell it had been dripping off the bottom of the water pump. So it's kind of one of those things that the pump was on its way and hadn't quite failed and wasn't leaking all the time. So one interesting takeaway from all of this is if you see that P2601 code thrown, then check your coolant level, because evidently if there's not enough coolant in the system, that will also throw that code. Alright, so first we need to remove all of these engine covers to make room to work on the vehicle. I've already removed these little clips. There's one here, 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 and here. These ones are a little bit unique in that the way they work is you unscrew them a little bit first, and then that releases the clip which you pull out of the body. So first we'll want to remove the oil cap and this center engine cover. Put this cap back so nothing falls down inside of it. Next, these two side covers. And then pull this gasket off. Pops off. Alright, so first to make room, we're going to remove this air intake here. There's a little hose in the back. It just pulls out. And now we've got much better access to everything that's going on here. And since we'll be draining the coolant out next, we'll want to go ahead and remove this cap here to let any pressure out of the system. Of course, you want to make sure that the engine is adequately full and pulling this off. All right, so next we've got to pull some covers off the bottom here so we can drain the coolant out. And so we're going to be removing this cover here, not this cover we've removed in other videos. And so this cover, you've got some clips up here, looks like 4 of them, and some bolt over here, but not over here, at least on my car, although yours probably has it. Got a couple other bolts here and some bunch of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 9 or 10 more of these clips along the front. Oh, maybe this isn't attached up here. Ha! Okay, so I thought this piece was attached up front here, but it's not. Looks like there's places for it. So this actually was missing from this car when I purchased it, and I added this. And so your car may have fasteners up here, but evidently I didn't realize that there were spots for them there. It hasn't hurt it all this time though. And just for future reference, this is the auxiliary water pump. It's a little small electric water pump. So that's one other thing that can throw that code we were talking about. And I replaced that one a couple of years ago. It's not too bad. Okay, so here's the difference already. The videos I watched in the first gen had the lower radiator hose right in here somewhere. And so on this vehicle, it's not quite as convenient. It's up here in this corner. See it right there. So right here. So that's going to be kind of a pain, but oh well. It's just in a horrible spot. God. Hand keeps locking up. Here it comes. Alright, we've got the old water pump completely removed, and the surface where the gasket was cleaned up, and so we're about ready to install the new water pump and the new gasket. And here's just a quick look at the old water pump here on the left and the new one on the right. So they look pretty much the same, other than the old one being a little rusty. And you can see here on this old one all the residue and everything. I'm guessing that it was leaking out from the seal here, because you can see how on the bottom there's a bunch of grime and residue and dried up coolant down here. So let's go ahead and get the new water pump bolted in place. Alright, here's the new gasket and the new water pump. And so I just want to line up the gasket in the right position. You might have to rotate it around a little bit to figure that out. And then probably the simplest thing to do is take a couple of the bolts and go ahead and slide them into position. And then that way that'll keep the gasket kind of lined up as we start to get the new pump mounted in place. Let's pause this video for a minute. This is the part of the job where we ran into a problem. I had read some information online, and actually at least one of the videos here on YouTube said that the proper torque procedure for tightening the water pump bolts was to first do a pass where you tighten them all to 11 foot-pounds, and then you go back around and do a second pass and tighten all 6 bolts to 22 foot-pounds. So we did the first pass at 11 foot-pounds, and it went alright, but it seemed like they weren't really getting tight. It just didn't feel right, and they just weren't getting snug. So we started to go through and do a pass of 22 foot-pounds, and immediately we noticed we weren't able to actually get any of the bolts to tighten to 22 foot-pounds. They were kind of topping out at around 18 or 20, and they just didn't feel like they were snugging up. And well, we quickly found the reason for that when one of the bolts sheared right off. So the reason they weren't tightening was because they were just beginning to stretch and twist. Now thankfully only one of them snapped off before we realized that we were doing it wrong. And so what we did was backed out the other 5, which came out without a problem, and we pulled the water pump back off, and there was still enough of the bolts sticking out of the front of the engine where we were able to remove it. Actually, we were able to reach down there and remove it with our fingers, so it was nice and loose. Didn't have to do anything crazy. So Almost had a panic attack, but not the end of the world. So did some more reading and digging online, and I don't know if all the instructions that I had found, like I mentioned earlier in the video, were for a first generation, or were done on a first generation, but it said it would work on both the first and second generation. So I don't know if this is one of those differences between the two for the torque specs, but I found more than one site that listed this 11 foot-pound, 22 foot-pound procedure. But then when I did some more digging, I found sites that, and information that said it was 89 inch-pounds, which comes out to about 7.5 foot-pounds. So that's quite a bit less. And some of the instructions there said you do a pass of 89 foot-pounds once, and then you go back around and a second pass and make sure that they're at 89 foot-pounds, and then you do a third pass where you go another quarter of a turn, or 45 degrees, I think it said. So there's some conflicting information, but it definitely seems like the second set of numbers is more on par. And what's even more interesting is that those same instructions said that these are basically one-use bolts. You're not supposed to reuse them. So that's a really interesting piece of information that I didn't see anywhere on any of the YouTube videos here or any of the other tutorials, is that these bolts should be replaced every time you replace the pump. Which kind of makes sense. They're, they get pretty hot, and I believe this is the original water pump to the car, so, because we've had the car for 7 going on 8 years, and it was only 2 years old when we got it, so I believe this pump has 100,000 miles on it, and so do these bolts. So this is probably why some of the pumps I saw online came with new bolts. Now the one I picked up at a local auto parts store did not. So what we did is we ran around to a bunch of auto parts stores, and they all said, oh no, we don't have these bolts. But we actually went and looked for ourselves. One of them had a whole rack of bolts, and we were able to find a match. These are pretty much an exact match for the original factory bolts. We found these at O'Reilly's, and so you can see the specs here on the front. These are a metric bolt. The head on these bolts is 11 millimeters, or at least that's the socket you use. And so this shows you the M6-1.0 times 25 millimeter. That's the correct size and threading. So you can see that with the factory bolt there on the right, and the new one that we bought at O'Reilly's on the left, and these went right into the engine block perfectly, and just like butter. So an exact match there. So we went ahead and bought 6 brand new bolts, and immediately we felt a difference. When we were snugging them up to more along the lines of 7.5, 8 foot-pounds, you could actually feel them snugging up, where the other ones just kept basically turning. It was a little bit nerve-wracking there for a little bit, but hopefully this will help someone else not make the same mistake. Because like I said, I just didn't see much of this mentioned anywhere else. But again, you can jot down this information here if you get a pump locally that doesn't contain new bolts. This is what you want right here, and I'm sure you can get them at other stores other than O'Reilly's, but these are the specs for the bolts. They were specifically rated for high temperature applications. In fact, these are a class 10.9 is its rating, and on one of the original factory bolts I was able to read an 8.8 rating. So these should be at least as good, if not a hair better, than the ones that came with the car. Alright guys, so we filled up the reservoir to the full line, and now we're going to start the car for a little while, blast the heat, and wait for it to pull it through. Okay, so we let it run for probably 10 or 15 minutes, long enough for the fans to really kick up and the air started getting a little bit warm. Cut it off, and about 5 or 10 minutes later, and this tank is just about bone dry. So it is finally, it didn't suck it through until after it sat and cooled back down. So so we'll fill it back up and let it sit for a little while and go through it again. So as far as working the coolant back into the system, what we discovered is, you know, after the initial filling the tank back up and getting the car up to temperature, the coolant level didn't go down at all. Then we shut it off for about 5 minutes, and after about 5 minutes or so, it pulled almost the whole tank back into the system. So then we filled it up, ran it for 5 minutes or so, and rinse and repeat. Basically, every time we shut the car off after bringing it up to temperature, it would then suck the coolant back down into it. And I think it took about three passes to stop pulling coolant down in. So I'll keep an eye on it over the next few days, but I want to say it took about 1.5 gallons, maybe close to 2 gallons. So there was still, of course, some in the system. We didn't probably drain everything out, but that'll give you an idea of what to expect. Alrighty everybody, that about does it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it helped you learn something about the process, and I hope you guys will consider subscribing.